Good evening. I'm Teresa Skubik, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, June 4th. We begin tonight with more tariff chaos south of the border. U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order on Tuesday, doubling the tariffs on steel and aluminum imports to 50%, a move one Canadian industry official warned would have unrecoverable consequences. The new rate took effect at midnight, according to the order. The move deepens the threat against industries in Canada's two largest provinces, Ontario as a steel production hub and Quebec as a major global aluminum producer. Prime Minister Mark Carney issued a statement in response to the U.S. jacking up the tariffs on steel and aluminum.
The latest tariffs on steel and aluminum are unjustified. They're illegal. They're bad for American workers, bad for American industry, and of course for Canadian industry as well. We have counter tariffs in a gross amount before remissions on over $90 billion of U.S. imports. We've acted strong. Those are in place. We will take some time, not much, some time, because we are in intensive discussions right now with the Americans on the trading relationship. Those discussions are progressing. I would note that the American action is a global action. It's not one targeted at Canada. So we will take some time, but not more, before we respond.
Despite the higher duties that will hammer Canada's steel and aluminum industry, Canada's U.S. Ambassador Kirsten Hillman and Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc both say that they are optimistic about finding a solution. And Ontario Premier Doug Ford addressed the media regarding the tariffs.
As the ambassador said, he doesn't speak for the president. Everyone feeds everything up to the president. The president makes a decision. Is this a good deal or is it not a good deal? In my opinion, it's a good deal when we have fair trade and free trade. We're a strong country. We're a resilient country, and it makes Americans even stronger than they already are. I did mention to the ambassador, 9 million Americans wake up every morning to produce a product, a widget, for Ontario alone. And no matter if it's steel or aluminum or tariffs on autos, it's a fair trade going back and forth, and it makes both countries stronger. I also reminded them, yes, they're our number one customer, and we appreciate that, but we're the U.S.'s number one customer. We buy 400% more cars than Mexico does, 200% more cars than the rest of the world buys off the U.S., and it's a good relationship, so we have to continue on with the relationship.
The Bank of Canada held its benchmark interest rate steady at 2.75% today as policymakers wait for more clarity on how tariffs will impact the economy. The central bank says there was consensus among its governing council for a second consecutive rate pause after inflation data showed unexpected firmness in April and the economy topped expectations in the first quarter of the year. But the Bank of Canada is expecting more weakness in the coming months as businesses and consumers rein in spending and the tariff impact starts to show up in economic data. Economist Dr. Moshe Lander joined us for more on the rate decision.
Dr. Lander, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Now, the Bank of Canada said that inflation data showed unexpected firmness. What does that mean?
It means that those tariffs are starting to spill over into higher prices. So we saw that the most recent inflation data actually dropped. But if you take out food and energy prices, inflation was actually rising. And so the Bank of Canada is looking at that, saying that this is not just some one-off that a carbon tax was canceled. It's that those tariffs are starting to push prices up. So I don't know that they necessarily want to go right to increasing interest rates, but they're going to watch and see how much damage is being done to the real economy, how much damage is being done to inflation, and that's going to decide the direction when they do move on where interest rates go next.
Do we have an idea on the total economic cost of both the tariff uncertainty and the tariffs that are in place?
Well, we've seen that GDP is falling now. And so where we've been talking in Canada about declining growth rates and the risk of a recession, we're now seeing the beginning embers of an actual recession. We need to see the data, of course, continue to see that the economy is shrinking. But the fact that it has started to is something that we haven't seen since COVID. And so there is a real worry then that the longer these tariffs remain in place, and with the increase in steel and aluminum tariffs from 25 to 50%, at some point that does start to drag growth maybe even further into negative territory. Sustained long enough, you got your recession.
And what do you think the Bank of Canada would need to see to lower rates again?
Well, it's really two competing forces now at play here. And this was the worry that I expressed back when Trump was reelected in November. On the one hand, you're going to see the economy starts to decline. That should necessitate interest rate cuts. But at the same time, you're starting to see inflationary pressures. And so that should necessitate interest rate increases. Which one of these two forces wins out determines the path of interest rates going forward. So if the economy really does decline in a meaningful way, the Bank of Canada might say, look, we can't afford to try and keep inflation under control by holding interest rates and ruining the real economy in the process. If inflation's the thing that starts to take off, then even if we see mild decreases in GDP, they might say that's a price worth paying. We cannot let the inflation genie out of the bag again. Canadians will remember from 2022 and part of 2023 how much damage was done merely by having inflation reach into the high single digits.
And on the other side, what would cause them to potentially increase rates?
Well, it's if that inflationary force wins out over the decline in GDP. And so if they feel compelled to try and stop that inflation train from leaving the station, they might go ahead and just increase interest rates, recognizing that that's going to hurt consumers, particularly consumers with mortgages coming up for renewal in 2025 and 2026. They might say, listen, I can't help you right now. That's the thing with monetary policy is it's a one size fits all. And it's not just for every province, but it's for every individual and business as well. And so there's certainly going to be some people who say the last thing that I need right now are increases in interest rates. But it's one of those things that if the Bank of Canada says the inflationary threat is real, they might move on that rather than being lax about it the way that they had to in the tail end of COVID.
And with Donald Trump's new announcement today that he's implementing 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Canada, how much of a role does this play in the Bank of Canada and the interest rate?
Well, that's part of the uncertainty that they're talking about. And of course, it happens to come on the same day when the Bank of Canada is making that interest rate decision. But at what point do the job losses start to accumulate? And if the job losses accumulate, this is going to put more stress on the government to try and provide support to them. Tax revenues are going to be smaller. The deficit's going to be bigger. And to finance that deficit, governments have to borrow money. And if they have to start borrowing money at higher interest rates, that means that there's going to be less money for public services and other sorts of support and transfer programs. So the Bank of Canada is going to be looking at that as well. The Bank of Canada is the agent and advisor to the government. And so they want to make sure that they're not putting the government into a position where fiscal policy might not be able to work anymore either because of the constraints that the Trump tariffs are doing to the Canadian economy.
Dr. Lander, thank you so much for the time today.
Anita?
And while the Carney government is a little over a week old, it appears as though the Prime Minister has changed his stance on a Bloc Québécois bill that would protect supply management from being included in future trade agreements. Dr. Sylvain Charlebois from the Agri-Food Analytics Lab has more.
Yeah, so on April 3rd during the election, he was actually talking to Radio-Canada in Montreal, and he was asked a question, do we need binding legislation to protect supply management? And his answer was clearly no. He basically didn't see any value in it. But last week, apparently he has changed his mind. He believes that legislation is critical, which will give a second life to Bill C-282, which is a bill I've actually testified against at Senate just in December. And so the bill basically would grant immunity to supply management, basically, should Canada enter any new rounds of negotiations with other countries, including the United States. And frankly, I think it's just a bad strategy because it would just make Canada weaker as a player. All countries have sensitive sectors, and Canada certainly has dairy as a sensitive sector for sure. And it would be totally normal for Canada to put on the table dairy as a sensitive sector. That's all you need, really. You don't need legislation to basically discourage any country, any region of the world to negotiate with Canada. And that's the signal we would send to the rest of the world.
We also asked Dr. Charlebois where supply management has made it difficult to negotiate trade deals in the past.
So in a couple of years ago, Canada wanted to negotiate a trade deal with the United Kingdom, and apparently supply management became an issue, or market access, particularly in dairy, was an issue, and Canada did mention that that's not negotiable. It's a non-starter, and we all know what happened next. The UK just walked away. And just recently, a few months ago, we learned that the UK was actually sealing a deal with the United States, which would probably make Canada less attractive for the UK. So we do have a trade deal with the EU, but we need more trade deals to be less reliant on the United States. And so I do see supply management as becoming an increasing diplomatic problem for Canada.
Coming up after the break, BC Premier David Eby is breaking away from the national unity message, saying he won't support any new oil pipelines going through his province. We'll have this story and more news coming up right after the break. BC Premier David Eby is moving away from the national unity message, saying he won't be throwing his support behind any new oil pipelines through his province. Mr. Eby's comments dismiss Ontario Premier Doug Ford's suggestion that the BC leader would change his mind. Mr. Eby says the publicly owned TMX pipeline is already running through BC, adding the province doesn't support lifting the ban on oil tankers off British Columbia's northern coast. He says it's not his job to tell Mr. Ford that it is extremely unlikely a tunnel will ever be built under Highway 401, or tell Alberta's premier the vision for a pipeline connecting Alberta and northern BC is many, many years off. In response to questions about Indigenous consultation on major infrastructure projects, Justice Minister Sean Fraser explained that the duty to consult does not mean that Indigenous communities have a veto over the approval process.
Government understand the declaration on the rights of Indigenous people to have free, prior, informed consent over all these projects?
Well, look, I think it's...
They have a veto is what I'm asking.
Well, the international commentary and the limited jurisprudence that we've seen on it indicates that we do need to fully engage, and to the extent there's the potential to have a more direct impact on Aboriginal and treaty rights, it demands a higher degree of engagement. The commentary has suggested to date that it's not necessarily a blanket veto power, but of course we're in new territory here. Over the course of the next generation, I expect the courts are going to do some significant work, but hopefully a lot of that work is actually going to be done as between governments and Indigenous peoples themselves through engagement and conversation.
So the courts will have to listen to what the government understands the principle to mean. And I'm asking, never mind the commentary, what do you and your Prime Minister understand free, prior, informed consent to mean? Does it equal a veto?
In most circumstances, I think it demands a very deep level of engagement and understanding of the rights that may be impacted, and to the extent that those rights can be accommodated, we should make every effort to. The explicit nature of a veto, so far my understanding is it stops short of a complete veto, but it certainly, in my view, heightens the demands upon government to engage fully, to both understand the nature of the rights that could be impacted by decisions taken by government, but also the heightened duty to accommodate those rights that are baked into our treaties and protected by our Constitution.
The federal government introduced new legislation on Tuesday that aims to both strengthen and streamline the immigration process, including new limits on asylum claims, while also cracking down on cross-border fentanyl trafficking. The proposed bill not only addresses several of the border security priorities highlighted by Prime Minister Mark Carney, but also some of the long-standing complaints voiced by U.S. lawmakers, diplomats, and Canadian police organizations.
This morning, I introduced Bill C-2, the Strong Borders Act. Among some of the key changes are new powers for border officers to examine goods destined for export, to prevent the transport of illegal goods, such as stolen vehicles. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies will also have some new tools to stop the flow of fentanyl and its precursors. By investing in advanced technology, by supporting our border personnel and law enforcement, we'll be able to better prevent illegal cross-border activity. We will do so while protecting charter rights of Canadians, safeguarding their privacy, and ensuring due process.
Our correspondent Wyatt Sharp joined us for the latest.
Wyatt, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you.
Now, how does this act aim to support the border?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different kind of policy proposals that Immigration Minister Gary Anatasanagiri is looking to implement. Certainly among them is kind of this idea of decreasing the amount of fentanyl that is pouring in to both Canada, but also the amount that Canada is bringing in to the United States. You've seen kind of that be really one of the key things that Donald Trump has been advocating for over the course of the trade war between the United States and Canada. He says the reason he's putting in place tariffs on Canada is because of the fentanyl. Of course, the numbers suggest that Canada doesn't actually contribute that much to the amount of illicit drugs that are in the United States. But nonetheless, the immigration minister, Gary Anattasangari, was actually asked about this yesterday in unveiling this policy, where he denied that they were doing this solely because of that. But certainly the irony is not lost on us.
And what does this do to address the fentanyl issue in Canada and at the borders?
Yeah, I mean, really, it comes down to just what kind of controls now various border agents and customs will have whenever you go to the border. A lot of these kind of changes are being made out to be new kind of monumental changes, if you will. But really, kind of speaking here, most of them are just powers that border agents already have, and that is just being expanded upon. So, for example, now they have the authority to cancel various immigration documents, to suspend immigration documents. Those were all things that these agents have had the power and the authority to do in the past, and certainly they have done. I mean, even just in the past few weeks before this act was introduced, you saw a number of headlines with respect to what border agents were doing with turning away various people at the border entering into the United States. So certainly that's one of them, but also, it really aims to kind of combat this issue of transnational crime and the fact that a lot of these drugs aren't just being originated in Canada, but rather they're being smuggled into Canada and then going south down to the United States. So certainly kind of there's a kind of faceted play here that the government is looking to make. They hope it works out successfully, and they hope that maybe it will kind of help convince Donald Trump to back down.
And so far, what has been the reaction to this new policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty new and early days, certainly at this point, because we haven't really seen a lot of the reaction because it hasn't actually gotten a debate in Parliament yet. The reality is whenever a bill or a piece of legislation of this nature gets introduced, oftentimes, the communications teams for all of the parties will kind of scramble to put together a statement. We haven't really seen that yet with respect to the Conservatives, who certainly have been advocating for border security and for more border security. So I think the expectation is that this will be something that they will fall in line with. But, we do kind of have to analyze the kind of little fine details within the bill as well. And just the fact that, if we are unable to kind of create for an environment where we are not putting a bunch of money into this policy, I mean, that might be when the Conservatives decide to not support it. They certainly advocate for fiscal responsibility whenever possible. And so, again, if this becomes a large kind of expenditure, if you will, for the government, this might be something that then the government will have to rethink the Conservative support.
Now, initially, the reason that Donald Trump had implemented tariffs was because of the problems at the borders. Now, do you think with this new policy, this will kind of make Donald Trump remove some of those tariffs or be a little more lenient with them?
I mean, it's a good question. And you saw even after Mexico came out and they kind of just basically made a very small effort, but something that was meaningful to Donald Trump, to say that they're going to work on their fentanyl problem. Of course, Mexico imports upwards of 25,000 pounds of fentanyl into the United States, whereas Canada, it's only about 50 to 100 pounds, not to downplay that, but certainly a much smaller number. And so, if Donald Trump took that seriously, he might, be a little more lenient. But again, I mean, it just kind of stems from the fact that a lot of people don't even believe this to be an issue at all. And so if Donald Trump does kind of believe that, fentanyl is a big issue for the United States, specifically coming in from Canada, that might kind of completely change the discourse.
Well, Wyatt, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you.
Canada's tourism industry might see a boost this year as Canadians boycott the United States and travel closer to home. The Conference Board of Canada estimates the net economic benefit for the domestic tourism sector could be as high as $8.8 billion. The think tank says that the April Travel Intentions Survey suggests roughly 27% of Canadian respondents are considering a trip to the U.S. in the next few years, a decrease from above 50% in the same survey last November. A man has been charged in a string of alleged hate-motivated assaults on women at Toronto's Union Station. Police say that they received multiple reports of assaults shortly before 9 a.m. on Monday. They say that a man was walking through the station and assaulted several women unprovoked. And federal U.S. officials say that the wife and 5 children of a man accused of throwing Molotov cocktails at demonstrators in Boulder, Colorado, have been taken into custody. U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem made the announcement on Tuesday in a post on X. Authorities say that Mohammed Sabri Solomon, an Egyptian national who has been living in the U.S. illegally, had 18 Molotov cocktails, but threw just 2 during Sunday's attack in which he yelled, quote, "Free Palestine." President Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, spoke on the recent anti-Semitic attacks in the U.S.
Yes, these anti-Semitic acts of violence do qualify as terrorism, and he does not want to see terrorism or violence of any form taking place in the United States of America. And as for specifically anti-Semitic terrorism and anti-Semitic acts of violence and those that are targeting Jewish Americans, this administration has done more to combat that violence than any administration in history. And one incident is one too many. And I think, frankly, that's something the previous administration was not willing to say. This president will stand up for Americans of all religions, of all faiths, of all creeds, and we will continue to look at policy measures and actions that we can take in addition to the actions that have already been taken to curb this anti-Semitic violence. And to Jewish Americans at home, across the country, this president has your back.
Coming up after the break, Delta Airlines is facing a growing number of lawsuits after a February 17th crash at Toronto's Pearson International Airport. I sat down with aviation expert John Braddock to break down the investigation. After that, the NHL Stanley Cup final begins tonight, with Florida and Edmonton facing off. We'll have these stories and more news coming up right after the break. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer embraced Elon Musk's criticism that the tax and spending cuts bill will explode the deficit and accused President Trump and Republicans of lying about the true cost of the legislation.
Well, I hear something happened while we were at lunch, which led me to make some news here today and say something I didn't think was imaginable. I agree with Elon Musk. Within the hour, he put on X the following. I have it right here so you can all see it. He said, "I'm sorry, but I just can't stand it anymore. This massive, outrageous, pork-filled congressional spending bill is a disgusting abomination. Shame on those who voted for it. You did wrong," he said to them. "You know it. It will massively increase the already gigantic budget deficit to $2.5 trillion and burden American citizens with crushingly unsustainable debt." It's right here. He's right. I'll leave it here. Republicans should listen to him and actually to their former selves, outraged about the national debt. Because it's here, Donald Trump's big, ugly bill is in the Senate. Behind the smoke and mirrors lies a cruel and draconian truth. Tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy, paid by gutting health care for millions of Americans. Over the past few days, President Trump has tried to sell his bill, saying people won't lose coverage, children won't go hungry, costs won't go up. Let's call that for what it is, lies. All of them lies. 14 million Americans will lose health care as they decimate Medicaid and now try to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. So this is an anti-health care bill, not just an anti-Medicaid bill, but an anti-health care bill. 20 million Americans will see their health care costs go up, many of them dramatically, so they might not even be able to afford health care. 11 million Americans, 4 million kids could lose access to federal food assistance. Hungry kids? Telling them to go hungry so billionaires can get an additional tax break? God bless the billionaires. They got plenty of money. They don't need a tax break. Our kids need to be fed.
And the White House is now speaking out, this time against Republican senators who are opposed to the spending bill, accusing several senators of not having their facts together. They also accuse the Congressional Budget Office of being biased.
Caroline. Caitlin. Two questions for you as well. On the big, beautiful bill, you said recently that it is, quote, blatantly wrong to say that it adds to the deficit. You essentially said that an estimate from the Congressional Budget Office and other scorekeepers you believe are wrong. But Republicans like Ron Johnson and Rand Paul disagree. They are saying that it will add to the deficit. That is their concern. Is the White House's position that those two Republican senators are, quote, blatantly wrong? It is. Those senators, it's not news that they disagree with this president on policy, and the president has vocally called them out for it and for their not having their facts together. I would add the Congressional Budget Office has been historically wrong. In fact, they predicted the Trump tax cuts from the president's first term in 2017. Their prediction was wrong by $500 billion. Those tax cuts had nearly $500 billion more of revenue than the Congressional Budget Office scored. And I would also point out, I don't think many people know this, there hasn't been a single staffer in the entire Congressional Budget Office that has contributed to a Republican since the year 2000. But guess what? There have been many staffers within the Congressional Budget Office who have contributed to Democrat candidates and politicians every single cycle since. So unfortunately, this is an institution in our country that has become partisan and political, and we are very confident in our own economic analyses of this bill. There is $1.6 trillion in savings, and our Office of Management and Budget Director, Russ Vought, is a fiscal hawk. He is well known in this city for being a well-respected fiscal hawk. He has tools at his disposal to produce even more savings. And as you know, the White House will be sending our rescissions package to Capitol Hill today.
Delta Airlines is facing a growing number of lawsuits after a February 17th crash at Toronto Pearson International Airport involving an aircraft operated by its regional partner. The incident, which resulted in 21 injuries but no fatalities, has prompted legal action from passengers alleging negligence and seeking compensation. The aircraft overturned on the runway, leading to a fire and the hospitalization of many on board. A preliminary report from the Transportation Safety Board of Canada indicated that the plane experienced a high rate of descent and a hard landing. Delta has offered $30,000 to each passenger as a good faith gesture, emphasizing that the payment does not affect their legal rights. The airline has refrained from commenting further, citing the ongoing investigation by Canadian and U.S. aviation authorities. I sat down with aviation expert John Graddick to break down the investigation.
John, thank you so much for the time today.
My pleasure to be here with you.
Now, what do we know right now about what caused the crash, and do we have a clear picture as to who is at fault in this incident?
Right now, the latest we had was an interim report from the Transportation Safety Board that talked a bit about a couple of situations that they noted in the incident. They were noting about their examination of their flight data recorder and the voice data recorder, and indicated that at 3 seconds prior to impact, that the airplane issued a notice to the cockpit crew about rate of descent too high, and about 1 second before they touched down, they noted that the angle of attack and the angle of approach was too shallow. So those are two pieces of information that have been released by the TSB internally. So there is no assignment of blame. There is no assignment of responsibility at this point in time. But they're just, letting what I call, a little bit of droppings here and there, just to give everybody a bit of an update. But there's still no indication as to responsibility.
And is it normal for an airline to offer payment that doesn't impact the legal rights of passengers?
That's an interesting development. When Delta offered $30,000 per person, I was taken aback, saying, there is an impression of some type of responsibility by Delta. The amount that they were offering, of course, was nowhere near what would have been or would be a settlement associated with a guilty announcement regarding mishandling of the flight or still situation where there was lack of training or lack of I think Delta kind of let the cat out of the bag a little when they offered that $30,000. That it sort of indicated to me that they were sort of accepting the fact there was some responsibility on the part of Delta for this flight and its crash at Toronto. But I think that legal eagles that are around here, trying to get people to sign up for this lawsuit. Are smelling blood in the water and are looking at some higher payout.
And are there any other historical examples of where plane crashes have ended with large payouts for passengers?
There's lots. There's lots of them. And there's many of them. They're the one that everybody sticks out, looks at it, was unfortunately one that had deaths associated with it. There were millions of dollars payout associated with those types of incidents. I think stand out are the ones that happened with Lion Air, in Airlines. With Barry John, the 737 MAX airplanes in 2018. So those are situations where the responsibility ultimately ended up being Boeing's hand. Yep. The payout and litigation is still outstanding on some claims. So, there is a precedent in terms of payout for damages, payout for emotional and for physical injuries. It could be substantially harder than helpful.
John, thank you so much for the time today.
My pleasure, Teresa. Have a great day. Take care.
Hudson's Bay Company will live on in some fashion, and what form it takes will solely be up to Canadian Tire. On Tuesday, the beleaguered department store got court approval to sell its intellectual property, including its iconic multicolored stripes motif, to Canadian Tire for $30 million. Bankrupt Hudson's Bay Company will use the cash to pay some of its debts before the 355-year-old retailer disappears entirely. And the NHL Stanley Cup Final begins tonight, with many Canadian hockey fans hoping that this is finally Canada's year. The Edmonton Oilers host the Florida Panthers in Game 1 of the Championship Series. It's a rematch of last year's final that saw Edmonton lose a heartbreaking Game 7 to the team from Sunrise, Florida. The clash this year comes with a bit more patriotism than usual, amid U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war and threats to make Canada a 51st state. Canada hasn't had a Stanley Cup for a generation, not since the Montreal Canadiens won it in 1993. Coming up after the break, we'll have more of today's top national and international headlines. As the prairie provinces continue to battle wildfires, the federal government has announced that it will match every dollar donated by Canadians to the Canadian Red Cross. Forum Daily will be right back after the break. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe said that upwards of 15,000 people across his province have fled devastating wildfires, and more are likely in the coming days. Mr. Moe says the biggest destruction has been in places like the northern village of Denair Beach, where some family homes have been lost.
We have some challenging days ahead of us as we aren't through this, and the weather doesn't appear to be changing in the near future. To date, we're probably approaching in the neighborhood of 15,000 people that have been evacuated across the province and being supported in communities throughout Saskatchewan. And more families are leaving their home as we speak. Many families are leaving their home and they don't know if they're going to see it again. They don't know if they're going to have the opportunity to go back there. And they aren't just buildings. These are places where they have raised their family or are currently raising their family. They're not just structures that are nailed together. They are family homes. It's important for us to remember when we get news like we did yesterday with significant by these fires places like Denair Beach in the last day, and it's difficult. It's difficult for families, and I want to thank everyone across the province that is supporting those families that are displaced and all too often are experiencing the loss.
And First Nation leaders in Manitoba are calling on provincial and federal governments to provide more equipment and resources to their communities to fight ongoing wildfires. They say some communities don't have the supplies that they need.
But it's shameful. It's shameful that at a time of a climate emergency, that this Liberal government continues to ignore what is now become the new normal. In fact, the Liberals are calling for the building of more pipelines and extraction projects, fast-tracking consultation processes, environmental assessments, getting rid of environmental assessments, jeopardizing free, prior, informed consent, a constitutional obligation they have with Indigenous peoples, violating their obligation to uphold the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, even though through Bill C-15, it affirmed its application in Canadian law. They continue to play games with the lives of people that are most impacted by extreme weather events. Extreme weather events, as I said, Mr. Speaker, that are becoming the new normal. And I can tell you that the NDP will continue to push the government to put in place permanent emergency response systems that take place in consultation with Indigenous people, that uphold the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples.
The federal government has announced that it will match every dollar donated by Canadians to the Canadian Red Cross in support of communities impacted by the devastating wildfires sweeping across parts of the prairie provinces.
Building a strong Canada means helping each other. So today, I'm announcing that the Government of Canada is matching donations to the Canadian Red Cross to support wildfire relief and disaster recovery efforts for appeals that are taking place in both Saskatchewan and Manitoba. This initiative will be further matched by the province of Saskatchewan and the province of Manitoba. I thank my counterparts and also Premier Moe and Premier Canoe for their partnership on this. As Saskatchewans and Manitobans continue to be displaced by these fires and more communities come under threat, the Canadian Red Cross is working closely and carefully with its provincial counterparts, with Indigenous leadership, and with all levels of government, in fact, to provide emergency accommodations, personal services, and critical information to people who have been forced from their homes.
Federal Health Minister Marjorie Michel says that she will not direct her department to intervene, as some provinces work to introduce involuntary treatment for addictions.
I think every single Canadian has the right to get treated. I won't tell you that to force them to be treated is a way to solve the problem. I don't think for now we would have any kind of real scientific evidence on this practice. I won't comment on what provinces are doing for now. I will sit down and see results, because I think we need to work closely together, but mostly we need scientific evidence proof on every time we are moving in a direction, and a lot with mental health. I'm not a doctor, but I'm a social psychologist. And so meaning that I'm very I know that world, not everything in the mental health space, but I'm more used to the mental health space. And that will be one of my top priorities.
Alberta, BC, and Ontario are introducing legislation to compel people into treatment for addictions. A new study shows high substance use and mental health issues among Canada's trade workers. Alexandra Keeler from Canadian Affairs has more on the growing problem.
There's a hidden crisis facing Canadian trades workers, mostly men, who are struggling with things like untreated chronic pain, mental health issues, and high substance use tied to their work. Not only are men and trades workers overrepresented in drug deaths, but a recent national survey commissioned by Canada's Building Trades Union found that chronic pain, poor mental health, stress, and burnout are driving ongoing substance use. I spoke to two trades workers, Sebastian, a 33-year-old former farmer and roofer from Southern Ontario, and Mike, a civil construction worker here in the GTA. They both said that pain, physical and emotional, are considered just part of the job. Sebastian described coworkers using in job site porta potties just to make it through the day. Mike said that he started using daily after his father died when he was 16, but he wouldn't dream of taking a mental health day. He said that he would just fake being sick. They both said that while mental health is abysmal in the trades, seeking help is still considered taboo. So even when benefits are available, most workers aren't using them for fear of seeming weak or facing consequences. Sebastian said, your self-worth is really tied to your productivity in this industry. And then in some cases, employers are fueling the problem. Mike said one boss gave him his crew a nightly beer stipend for an out-of-town job. And this goes beyond a few bad job sites. They said workers are dealing with extreme weather, harmful inhalants, long hours, isolation if they're working on a remote site, and in many cases, low pay. So they're using things like stimulants, cocaine or meth to help them stay alert and get through those long hours. And then opioids help to dull the pain, to keep them going and going to work every day. There's this deep culture of stoicism, and sometimes the financial precarity makes it hard to turn down shifts.
We also asked Alexandra about whether these cases are part of a larger trend or simply anecdotal, and what experts are saying about the issue.
And it isn't anecdotal anymore. That national survey found 1 in 3 trades workers has a work-related injury requiring pain management, and those people are significantly more likely to use substances to cope. Nearly half said that their mental health is poor or fair. A quarter are using substances to manage stress or burnout. Like I said, most unions do offer mental health supports, but few workers are using them. Lindsay Amundsen from the Building Trades Union said that stigma is a huge barrier, and even unions don't fully understand its roots. She said that workers fear losing their job, or being drug tested, or being seen as unreliable. And then some are turning to harder to detect street drugs like opioids to avoid getting caught. Experts are saying that employers need to stop treating addiction and mental illness as like a personal or disciplinary issue, and start seeing them as workplace safety concerns. The United Steelworkers Union here in Toronto told me that workplaces themselves could be contributing to the problem. They were actually aware of a lot of the anecdotal troubles that I heard about from workers on and off record. The union's calling for more employer accountability, real investment in mental health care, and a national safety standard that includes a psychological well-being component. And then some unions are, they're trying. Stuart Simpson from Smart Local 47, representing Eastern Ontario, told me that they're training workers to challenge the bullying and stigma tied to mental health. It's a part of their training. And the survey has also led to the formation of a national mental health committee, which met for the first time in May, which is a good sign. It's a promising step, but the survey was conducted over a year ago, and it's been another year of preventable deaths.
I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca. Good night, Canada.